All right, welcome back. So for our next speaker, if you've ever read anything about cybersecurity, come across anything that has anything to do with cybersecurity or threat intelligence, you've probably seen the phrase an ever-evolving threat landscape. Please don't ever use that. Like, we all know that's ChatGPT, and so we all clock that's ChatGPT. Please don't ever use that. But our next speaker, Brian Donahue, would like you to know also that that phrase is a lie, and that our adversaries are not so much evolving as they are endlessly recycling. So Brian is a principal security researcher at Red Canary, and he has been writing without ChatGPT, I assume, and speaking about security for about 15 years. So please welcome Brian.
So I am excited and nervous, or maybe both. Can't really tell the difference between those feelings. To be back at AttackCon speaking again. As Amy just said, I'm going to be talking about this idea of the never-evolving threat landscape. And this is a theory that I've been cooking up probably for like the entire 15 years that I've been in InfoSec. And over the last 5 or 7 years, I've come up with this idea of forever techniques, and the two things are really tightly bound to one another. So I included an agenda in my talk so that you would all know that I do indeed have a plan, and this is my plan. So I'm going to introduce myself in a second, wait for it, and then I'm going to tell you my conclusion up front, right? Because like this isn't an M. Night Shyamalan movie. This is a conference talk. There shouldn't be surprises or suspense. And then I'm going to work backwards from that, and I'm going to show you the evidence that I've used to sort of come to this conclusion. And then I'm going to take a look at a couple of examples from like recent reporting to really drive home like how this has become kind of entrenched in my mind and how I get reminded of this every time I read some report that's written by some vendor or whoever. And then at the end, if I time this out correctly, we will have time for questions, although you can, of course, also just find me around here today or tomorrow or ask me questions in the Slack. So who am I, anyway? If you've been to AttackCon before, you may have met me. I've been to every AttackCon. I think I've spoken at every AttackCon except one, either doing silly lightning talks where I talk about dumb things like pushing or coming up here and talking about more proper MITRE ATT&CK stuff. But my name is Brian Donahue. I am a principal security researcher at Red Canary. I'm here today all the way from over in Alexandria, Virginia, which to those of you who are local, that means that I had to get on the Beltway to come here. I'm a member of like the pampered laptop work from home class, so driving on the Beltway is both traumatic and upsetting, but I did it because I really, really like this conference. So I do for work a lot of things at Red Canary. There's only really one thing that matters in the context of the talk that I'm going to give today. And that is that for the last 7 years, I have analyzed all of the threats and all of the techniques and the metadata associated with those things that we detect at Red Canary in the service of writing an annual report called the Threat Detection Report. And so we've written, I think, 7 full threat detection reports, plus an additional 2 mid-year reports that we added to our sort of repertoire of threat detection report things over the last couple of years. And the threat detection report is both all of these reports and then like the corpus of data that underlies these reports. And that data is kind of what I'm going to be drawing on largely during this presentation. So, you know, like on a monthly or biannual basis, I'm ranking and stacking the MITRE ATT&CK techniques that we're detecting across our customers, looking at, you know, shifts in technique use or the lack thereof, as the case may be, but also looking at threats. Shout out to Steph Rand somewhere here. She's going to be talking later. She helps write our monthly Intel Insights where we rank our threats every month. So we're tracking these things. We're keeping a close eye on them all the time. And like at the end of all of this analysis, we come up with a report that's basically split into these 3 big sections where we talk about big picture trend things that are happening across the industry, both within and without Red Canary's, or I guess both within and beyond Red Canary's visibility. But we also talk about like the specific named threats or malware tools that we're detecting. And importantly, in the context of this talk, the techniques that we're seeing, focusing mostly on those that are either super prevalent enough to be in our top 10, or interesting enough to warrant us talking about them, maybe because they're moving up or down the top 10 or for whatever reasons. So the data underlying the threat detection report over the 7 years that we've done it is literal exabytes of security telemetry that gets ingested from endpoints and identities and cloud resources from machines all over this great big world. And from all of that, by my count, we have detected at least 265,000 confirmed threats. And within those confirmed threats, again, by my count, we have had 287,000 technique mappings in the data set across all of these reports, right? So like detect PowerShell and a threat, that's 1, count all the way up to 287,000. That's how many, that's how big our metadata sample is for attack mapping. So this is all nice, but why is it relevant? So I'm gonna lay out my hypothesis right now, and I hope it's not an unhinged argument, but we will find that out in due course. So what I often see when I read headlines is that threats always seem to be novel or evolving, right? So we've got attackers adopting a novel living off the land technique. We've got cyber threats that are evolving faster than defenses. And as Amy said earlier, like this idea of the ever-evolving threat landscape, I was going to do a joke, but she already told it, about how anytime you ask any LLM to write anything about cybersecurity, it starts with some iteration of the ever-evolving threat landscape. But the problem with this is that when I look at the technical details of these reports that I was just showing you, or I look at the data that I have access to, what I actually find is things like adversaries using the Windows worker process to spawn command.exe, right? Like this is something that I know from personal experience Red Canary has written about going back multiple years. We see things like social engineering, right? Like this second little box here, this seems to be some sort of help desk social engineering. Help desk social engineering like goes back, I don't know how long. It has been a core tenet of Elder fraud for 20 years. We see, Patchwork APT using PowerShell to deliver payloads by scheduled tasks. We see NPM compromises. Like if you've been living under a rock, you might think NPM compromises are new, but they have been going on for literally ever. So here's the theory. Adversaries abuse the same relatively small set of techniques. I think that this is evident both in annual reporting. I think it's demonstrated in technical breach reports. And I also think that it's demonstrated, I know that it's demonstrated in the operational data that I have access to. Novel threats, it's not that they don't exist, it's that they are exceptional and they are scarce. And when we think we're seeing things that are sort of evolving or novel, I think oftentimes what's actually going on is we're confused by threat nomenclature, right? We collectively, us and people outside this room, have created a horrible labyrinth of threat names that none of us will escape alive from. I think another thing is changes in visibility in technology. So to call myself out, like I write a threat detection report that showed this wild increase in identity threats. Now that wasn't because bad guys woke up one morning and were like, you know what we should do? We should target identities. No, it was that Red Canary started selling a product that does identity threat detection and response. So all of a sudden, we had all these identity threat data. It doesn't diminish identity threats because as soon as we looked, we found them everywhere. But like visibility is super important in shaping the way that we perceive the threat landscape. And then I think technical variance is also super important. So In the very, very, very first AttackCon, my colleague Kyle was up here, and he was talking about how not all attack techniques are created equal. And we had this image, shout out to Milan, our director of creative, where we zoomed in on the MITRE ATT&CK matrix on the PowerShell technique, and then as it went through, it came out the other end, and it was like you were looking at the universe, right? So there is definitely complexity, and there is a lot of variance in techniques, which makes it difficult to provide coverage for all of them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these things are evolving or that they're novel. So, as promised, let's take a gander at what I mean when I'm saying forever techniques. Who loves stats? Everyone loves stats. So remember what I said, there were 387,000 attack mapping things in our data set? Well, those collectively account for 397 attack techniques. I should have looked to see how many attack techniques there are. I should note that when I say attack techniques, I am using techniques and sub-techniques interchangeably. So importantly though, when I started looking at our data set, and I should note, I went from 2021 to the first half of 2025. You may be asking yourself, why did you choose such an odd period of time? And I wish the answer was that pre-2021 was sub-techniques, when sub-techniques got implemented, but that's not even the truth. We just, when we implemented sub-techniques, I organized the data weirdly, and to get a good apples-to-apples comparison, I had to start in 2021. And then I went to the half of this year just because I wanted as new of data as possible. So over that time, 75% of total detection volume involved at least one of our 30 top techniques. 66% of that detection volume included at least one of the top 20 techniques, and a full half of our detection volume included one of our top 10 techniques. So you're probably asking yourself, what are these techniques? Well, you're in luck, because I've got them right here. So these are the top 30. You can take a picture. I'll probably post these online at some point, and they'll definitely end up online because I'm being videotaped right now. So happy to say, shout out Adam. We do have a Linux technique in here in Unix shell. I haven't looked closely enough through all of these to know if there's more, but there's your top 30, right? So when we write the threat detection report, we haven't covered all of these, but we've covered a whole lot of them. And then here's our top 20. I think we probably have covered all of these, albeit possibly under a different name at some point, like DLL, I think used to be DLL hijacking and sideloading and maybe got collapsed. You'll have to ask an attack person. But these are our top 20 techniques. These bounce in and out of our top 10, and they pretty much show up, every year or every couple of years. It's rare to have something new pop in here. Cloud Accounts is one of the few exceptions to something that's come in that's new. But again, that's because of Red Canary's visibility and going from being an endpoint managed detection and response company to one that is more broadly scoped. And then here's our top 10. All right. So, and the kind of operational or tactical reason for me sharing this all with you is because my earnest belief is that the vast majority of breaches that are occurring are involving either one of these techniques or more broadly one of these, or even more broadly still one of these. So advice time, if you're not really good at detecting all of these things, you've got a really great place to start expanding your detection coverage. If 30 is too many, start with 20. If 20 is too many, start with 10. If you're doing great with all this, good job by you. All right, so I should note, I'm just talking about Red Canary data up to this point. My theory, though, is that while if you go to a different vendor and look at their top techniques list, you will get a different list because they have a different sort of aperture that they're looking at the threat landscape through. But I suspect their lists are consistent as well, right? So right now I've got the Center for Threat Informed Defense's sort of aggregated view. And so I bet if you asked them, they would be yeah, year over year, we've got 10 techniques that show up pretty much all the time, or 20 or 30 or whatever the number is. The one on the bottom that says top techniques is Red Canary, and then the other one is Palo Alto Networks, which is actually only execution techniques, so it was too hard for me to get all of them on the slide. But the point being, I bet if you cherry pick a couple vendors and you pay attention to the way they rank attack techniques over time, it will at least be consistent. And so in order to come up with your own list of forever techniques, like maybe you want to take Red Canary's word for it, or maybe you want to go out and try and find as many of these as possible and aggregate them. I think the Center for Threat Informed Defense is doing a praiseworthy job of trying to create like the one attack ranking list to rule them all. But it's a thing that I've really, really wanted to exist forever. And I have been, largely disappointed in that regard, with the exception of with this CTID list here. All right, why is this the case? So I have a sub-theory here that most intrusions follow a pretty basic pattern, right? If I'm the bad guy, I'm going to case the joint, I'm going to kick in the door, I'm going to grab the loot, and I'm going to run away. So like within each of these pillars, you only have so many options available to you for what you can do, right? So like you need to do some kind of reconnaissance to figure out what you're actually going to target. Then you need to gain initial access by some means. There's only so many ways you can do that. They're dependent on the technologies that you're targeting. Then you're going to steal something, probably, whether it's money or intellectual property or compute or credentials. And then you run for your life. You got to leave and get out with whatever you stole. So to kind of think about this from a threat perspective, so this is one example, right? I'm stealing something, but there's obviously sort of sub-variations of this. So what do threats kind of do in aggregate? They steal, they deliver other threats, they encrypt and disrupt, they extort. There's probably other things, right? I'm sure there are, but just a few examples. And there's only so many ways you can do this, right? So just choosing threat delivery as an example, how are some of the ways that adversaries are delivering threats, particularly to the people whose data I've or the organizations where I'm able to sort of figure out what's happening there. So when I looked at I just took the top 10 threats from Red Canary over a period of time, and I said, how are these being delivered, right? They're being delivered by potentially unwanted programs, compromised browser extensions, fake browser updates, like SOC-Golish is always coming in the form of these fake browser updates, malvertising and SEO poisoning, which I was writing about that a decade ago, more than a decade ago, back when I was a journalist covering information security. If anything proves my point here, it's that malvertising and SEO poisoning still work. And then increasingly things like these paste and run, fake CAPTCHA, click fix schemes, which again, I think maybe my colleague might be talking about more in depth this afternoon. So I will raise this one question in the air though, is this paste and run thing a novel threat technique? I'm gonna let that hang because we're gonna get to it in a minute. I have one more vain attempt to illustrate my point here, all right? We're gonna use a real world example. I'm a bad hacker guy, and I want to put my sweet Hacker Cruise logo on the MITRE ATT&CK website, right? In ASCII, skull and crossbones, really sick, hardcore stuff. So how do I do that, right? I have really limited options for how I can do that. I got to find, and because this is AttackCon, I decided to map them all back to attack techniques. So I need to find an administrator on the website, right? I got to gather victim identity information. And then I have to get creds, which I have a variety of ways I can do that, but we'll choose to use a spear phishing link here. And then I'm gonna need to actually put that logo on the website, right? So I got to load up the logo. That's the defacement part. And then because I want that thing to stay there and for my crew to get cred for a longer period of time, I have to do some account access removal. So I got to find out who has access to update the website. I got to take away their access, right? This is obviously a silly example, but the point I'm trying to drive home here is for each of the things that I want to do here, I have a limited set of options. So the options to me are finite, and that's why we see sort of very little drift over time in the techniques that are being abused most prominently. All right, so we're going to close here with a few case studies where I'm going to look at sort of TTPs, and I'm going to talk through whether or not I think what's happening is new or evolving. Again, to reiterate, evolving threats are rare, novel ones are rarer. I don't want to leave you with the impression that threat campaigns aren't complex. They are complex. They can be tremendously complex. They've always been complex, but that doesn't mean that they're novel, and that doesn't mean that they're evolving. I read a bunch of APT reports when I finally got around to thinking about this talk, and while I was nervous that I had written a check that I wasn't going to be able to cash, I actually found immediately that I had a very hard time finding anything that was like truly novel tradecraft. Novel threats, when they do happen, are highly targeted. They are unlikely to target the majority of organizations, and therefore not something that most people should spin their wheels about, or they're altogether unseen. Like, we just don't know they're happening, which is a different problem altogether. And then when there is emergent tradecraft, it is often surrounded by kind of well-worn, well-understood techniques, which is exactly what I'm going to talk about after this slide. So I maybe should have front-loaded this, but I felt right here. Anyway, when I use these terms, when I say evolve, like evolve is something going from a simple to a more complex form, right? It has to become more complex. And then novel, fortunately, is very subjective, and is so it's something that's new or unusual in an interesting way. So fortunately for me, I get to decide what's novel, which makes my point easier to make, which brings us to the next slide. Is this click fix, fake CAPTCHA, paste and run business novel? If any of you don't know what it is, it's basically like bad guy presents you with CAPTCHA or something to copy and paste, and you copy and paste the thing either by clicking the CAPTCHA or manually copying and pasting it, and then they're like, oh yeah, open the Windows Run dialog box, paste that in there, and then bad things happen. So, is this novel? Tricking people with the Run dialog box might be novel. I don't know. Like, I'm sure someone somewhere will be like, that's not new. I saw this in 2013. But what I know isn't new is what happens after that, right? So in a lot of the activity that we've seen, like what happens after that little trick with the Windows Run dialog box is like an encoded PowerShell command gets executed. Encoded PowerShell commands are like one of the things that we detect more than anything else at Red Canary, or it downloads a payload via MSHTA, right? Both of these things are detectable by like existing technologies that have existed for a very, very long time. Now let's take a look at a campaign. So I was thinking, like, what is the like campaign du jour right now? And I landed on Salt Typhoon, right? They're targeting infrastructure providers and telecoms in the US. Also, just so happens that like the former head of the NSA was literally talking about this. I like finished watching football and 60 Minutes comes on, and the former head of the NSA is talking about Salt Typhoon on 60 Minutes, and he's talking about some plant in Littleton, Massachusetts that got compromised because of an unpatched edge device. So shout out Domain Tools. I just sort of arbitrarily chose their blog to talk about this. Went down to the TTPs in there and asked, okay, how is Salt Typhoon getting in? They're exploiting known bugs in VPNs, firewalls, and routers. They're targeting network edge devices. Like, who isn't, right? They leveraged rootkits to maintain access, like maybe sophisticated, but rootkits are 30 years old at this point. They're leveraging things like modified SSH keys. They're dumping credentials via Com Services DLL using Run DLL 32. We have covered this extensively in the LSAS memory and Run DLL 32 sections of the threat detection report. It's probably even mentioned in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I should have checked. They're evading defenses and elevating privileges using things like LOLBins and tokens and SEDebug privilege. Like, there are piles of existing research for all of these things all over the internet. Again, the encoded PowerShell commands, one of our most prevalent detectors. Now, they also mess with configurations and sort of manipulated logs on infrastructure devices. Now, I don't really know what they meant by infrastructure devices, so maybe good job by them. But at the same time, like, we've all read about attacks where logs get deleted and configurations get changed. So it's nothing insanely evolutionary there either. So I think I have time for one more here. I chose this one almost entirely because I thought this fish was pretty cool. I have no idea who UAT 899 is, but I guess they're a Chinese-speaking cybercrime group that targets high-value IIS servers for SEO fraud. So let's look through what they're up to. So to get in, they abused a misconfigured IIS server. It didn't restrict the kind of file uploads that were allowed there, so they were able to upload some kind of payload into there. They uploaded a web shell, used it as a backdoor, collected information from it, created guest accounts, hello, valid accounts, one of MITRE ATT&CK's most broadly scoped techniques. They used RDP to continue to control that compromised server. They elevated their privileges with a public tool. I didn't list what the public tool is here because I went to the website and immediately regretted it, and I hope I don't get fired. They then dumped creds with ProcDump. We've all heard of ProcDump. They installed this bad IIS malware, lots of blogs about bad IIS on the internet, and then they installed a security tool to keep others out, which is interesting, but we literally just wrote a blog at Red Canary like 3 weeks ago about these bad guys installing patches after they gain initial access to keep other people from exploiting the same bug and taking over sort of what they, I guess, perceived was now their turf. And then like sort of generic other bad things, chicanery involving scheduled tasks, DLL sideloading, and Cobalt Strike. Big picture here, right? Everything I just said, there's a technique for that. And if there's a technique for that, it means that someone came to MITRE and said, hey, this happened in the wild. Because MITRE is in the business of putting hypothetical techniques into their framework. So I'm going to attempt to give you guys some actionable advice before I take as many questions as I possibly can. Identify prevalence, right? Find that relatively small set of techniques that adversaries are abusing, and then focus your coverage on those, right? Get good at detecting forever techniques, and you will get good at detecting most commodity threats that exist now and in the future. I also come bearing a message of optimism. I get sick of hearing that we're losing. We're not losing. We're not outmatched. We're doing great, sort of. We know, because we know what we need to do, right? We know that if we can focus on the fundamentals a lot of the time, that's going to eliminate a lot of our attack surface. Unfortunately, that is easier said than done. Like that plant in Littleton, Massachusetts that was on the news on 60 Minutes, like they had old devices. They didn't have money to buy new devices. Those devices weren't being supported. But the important thing is like we know what the problem is, and it's not an insurmountable one. And that is all I have. Any questions?
Thanks, Brian.
Oh, were you going to ask me a question?
No, that fellow is.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thank you very much. So one of the fears that I see, particularly in the SLED space right now, is an incredible sense of reticence now that MS-ISAC is changing the way that it is, and people thinking, how am I going to even get threat feeds anymore? Are you proposing that if they maybe focus very heavily on the top 30, top 20, top 10, that they can alleviate some of that fear and no longer need those feeds?
So the question was, is Brian proposing that by focusing on the top 30, top 20, can these organizations in the SLED space alleviate cyber attacks?
Yes, I do think that. And like you brought up MS-ISAC, I wish that, well, I wish generally that like big mega vendors like Microsoft would just list this stuff every month. Like tell us what you're seeing. I understand the reluctance to do it, but like if a giant company like Microsoft was like, hey, by the way, here are the top 10, top 20, top 30, top 100 threats that we're seeing across Microsoft, like everybody would need to pay attention to that. But I don't know, for whatever reason, they're not doing it. So I would love to see that. Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.